Maybe you could start off just by sharing a little bit more. You worked at big companies like PwC and Amazon, and you switched up the script here, moving from Barcelona to the Silicon Valley. You got that MBA at Stanford, which amazing university, and then you also went to Y Combinator, which is another amazing school. So, what made you want to join the startup world and become a founder?
Yeah, good question. So actually, I spent time in these big companies, but like my first job out of right after college was, funny enough, at a gaming startup. So I had studied business and law, and I had been working with PwC during college, like helping with like the legal advisory side of things of M&A transactions. But like the last few years of college, I got the startup bug. And instead of like deciding to go through that path of like either consulting or law, I decided to join a startup. So at the time I was in Barcelona, like the startup ecosystem there was really, really nascent. Like there were not a lot of companies there, but I was like, okay, I need to find the most well-run startup in this city, join and just learn how this is done. So I ended up joining this gaming startup called Akamon at the time. And that's where everything started. But then like after I spent like almost a year there, and then so Amazon at the time was like rapidly expanding in Europe. This was around 2013. And at some point they were opening up their Spanish office, and I was invited to join them like as part of the early Amazon Marketplace team. And like in pursuit of like this learning of like tech and I mean, Amazon is a company that is very interesting because it's a big company, but also they do a lot of things like a startup. So I decided to make the move and join them, which ended up being a very formative experience for me.
What's your biggest takeaway from that experience in terms of like operational expertise and business?
The biggest takeaway, so Amazon is known for customer obsession, and that's something that they talk a lot about. And a lot of companies talk about customer obsession, right? But I think my biggest takeaway was like how you are customer obsessed for real. Like they took that principle that they call it like super seriously, and it was embedded in the whole company. And you could see how, like that drove like a lot of like their success, just being focused there. The other big principle that I still like think about today a lot is like the principle of ownership. They like structure the company in a way. I think like one of the keys to being able to continue to churn out like new products in very different industries and be successful at it was like how they give ownership to all the teams to be decision makers of their own, and don't create like this super hierarchical structure that a lot of companies end up creating as they grow. Like so they managed to keep teams pretty nimble and make decisions on their own, which is like, it has worked really well for them, right?
And then you decided to go out and start something, and you Jupiter, if I'm not mistaken, a creator-driven recipe and grocery shopping platform. Where did the idea for that startup come from, and how did you find your co-founders and go from idea to execution right out of the MBA?
So I started the company when I was at the MBA. So after having spent that almost 4 years at Amazon in Spain, I decided to move to Silicon Valley and for my MBA at Stanford. And I met my co-founder Chad like first quarter of the MBA, and we started kind of like talking about ideas and really like draw a plan of like how to spend the next 2 years of the MBA, just like exploring different theses. And Jupiter evolved a lot. Like we tested a bunch of things. The initial idea that we had was, or like how Jupiter was born, like was we were doing like delivery. It sounds super crazy these days, but like it was delivery inside your home. So we were doing like what we called at the time last meter delivery company. You should imagine, like, you should think about the world pre-pandemic. Obviously, that this was like 2019, and we had seen like, also like me through my experience working at Amazon, we had seen that like sometimes like delivering to the door, as it was common, was creating like a lot of problems logistic wise. Like at least in San Francisco and certain cities in the US, a lot of packages were stolen when they were delivered to the door. Also, like there was like kind of like this weird phenomenon that like normally like the people that needed grocery delivery the most, or the busiest people, were normally the ones that were never at home at the time because they were kind of like at work for many hours. So we decided to launch this service that was basically like grocery delivery, but that you would give access to your home and then we would deliver inside of it. So that was the initial idea. And yeah, that's what we joined Y Combinator to do. And that was our idea until COVID hit,
yeah, COVID
like a few months later.
A pretty stark, change, because all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah. And you can't interact with anyone in the physical world for a while. So that made it. So what do you do when you're, hit with that particular challenge? How did you react to that?
So the pandemic was a very interesting, it had a very interesting impact on our business. It was twofold. Like on one hand, obviously, like we had been operating like this company, like this model, like this past model for 9 months. We were finding success. Like we were acquiring a lot of customers. Things were working well. Like we were solving the problems. Like we had to do a lot of things around trust, as you can imagine. Also like operationally, a lot of things. And the pandemic meant that we had to stop kind of like the core, like we had to stop obviously delivering inside the homes, but that was kind of like the bad impact of the pandemic. But on the other hand, the pandemic created like a massive demand for grocery delivery. And there was like this period in which like there was a huge mismatch of demand and supply, and like the main players at the time, like Instacart, Amazon, Fresh, and so on, like could not keep up with the sudden increase in the demand. So it was like a period of crazy growth for us, because basically what we decided was like, okay, we're going to stop delivering inside the home, but like we're going to continue delivering to the door for a while. And we also didn't know how long that was going to last. So our reaction was like, okay, let's, make the most out of it and continue like acquiring new customers through this time. So yeah, we were growing super fast at the time, but after a while, when we realized that the pandemic was gonna stay with us for longer, we had to make a decision of like, okay, we can continue doing this, but it's gonna be very hard to compete with these big players without having like a massive differentiation long time. So we had to make a hard decision to pivot the business to what it looks like today, which is more of an asset-light play, focused on creators. Yeah. So it was a big shift and like some months of a lot of uncertainty adapting to this new reality.
We'll double click on that in a second. I want to ask you something around your move to Silicon Valley, because in my chat with James Courier, who you work with at NFX, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he talked about like these centers of all this activity, and you physically moving into a certain place like actually permits you to have opportunities. You came from Spain, from Barcelona, and that's a burgeoning ecosystem, but it's much smaller, obviously, than other ecosystems. And it allowed you to raise venture, launch a startup, and now you're working as an investor at NFX. So do you think that other founders should pick up? I mean, if you're a LatAm founder and you're trying to, build something at scale and raise serious venture and attack a really important market, I know that YC really encourages everyone to move to the Silicon Valley, and that's like a strong thing that they state. Do you think that is the right fit for most startups? Like, should they be doing that more?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I would say that it's the right fit for every startup. I mean, it really depends on like what you're building, and I don't know. I think like, for example, being closer to customers probably is more important than like staying in the Bay. I do think that as a founder is important to make sure that you spend some time in your life in Silicon Valley, kind of like getting like in touch with like how people here think about company building. Like at the end of the day, I mean, Silicon Valley, it's been like the center of startups for many years, and like the density of people who knows about startups, who's done it before, is super high here. And I think, yeah, like being in touch with that, like really changes your mindset in terms of like how things are done and how to think about it. Like for me, it was a massive change, like coming here, like from Spain. Like, yeah, I for example, a big thing for me was like in Spain, I think people are a bit more afraid to think big, or like not a lot of people know like what's possible in a way, like in the world of startups. So when I came here, I was coming with this mindset of, okay, I'll go there. I will learn a lot, like kind of like continuing this path of like, okay, I learned from the startup that I worked at. I learned from Amazon. Now I will learn at Stanford. But then when I arrived here, I realized that the mindset here was more like, no, the way you learn is just by doing it and starting to try. And, like you won't be good at certain things at the beginning, but like you are gonna have people around you. Like it's more about like start trying early and make sure that you kind of like are close to people that have done it before and that can help you accelerate that learning. So that was a massive mind shift for me. Like when I came here, I was never coming with the idea of like I'm gonna start a company during the MBA, but I arrived here and everyone was like, no, I want to do this now. So this thinking big was something that I kind of like absorbed from the environment. So I think that's why it's important to have some contact. And maybe like if you cannot move here, if you've never spent time here and you're already like starting your business, I don't know, in Latin America, maybe you don't have the luxury of say, okay, now I'm going to spend a lot of months there, but like making sure that you come from time to time and build relationships here, I think can be very valuable to your journey as a founder.
What would be your advice to a founder that's listening that doesn't have a network in the Silicon Valley and didn't go to Stanford? How would you go about assembling a network that's going to enable you to kind of penetrate some of these inner circles? Because let's face it, I was actually kind of joking about this with some CEOs that were here from Los Angeles. They were in Mexico City, and they were doing like a couple-day tour and meeting with different executives and companies and local kind of government. And I kind of told them my story, and they're like, it sounds like you were a real outsider and now you're an insider. And I was kind of reminiscing on that because everything opened up when I met a few people that introduced me to a handful of investors, or wrote a check, and then all of a sudden I could leverage their credibility. You are a very unconnected person in Latin America, and you want to start networking in the Silicon Valley. What would be your process?
Yeah. So, and we're talking about someone that is a founder, right? Not like someone starting their careers.
No,
example.
Founder that's building a company and is looking to be more plugged into the scene.
Yeah. So I think my first step would be to literally make a list of the founders in my city or country that are connected to the Silicon Valley, and start building relationships with them, like people that are closer to you. I think sadly, it might be a bit hard to start building the connection right away with the Silicon Valley. But I think like finding these people that are kind of like in your network, but that are also in that network, those can be like really transformational to you. So I will start building a network with them, and then, ask them for like proof that you're someone that, is very serious about doing this, like starting a company that is very ambitious. I would also like consume content, to be honest, like from the Silicon Valley. I would like read everything. I think that's something very special about the times that we're living in, that like you can learn a lot just online and hear from these people, like people here in Silicon Valley online. So I would start by doing a mix of it and just like proving these connectors that I'm someone serious, ambitious, and then like from there, maybe like after a time, plan a trip to the Silicon Valley and ask for these same people to introduce me to people in San Francisco and start spending time together. That would be how would I start. And at some point someone will, give you a chance, and then you will use that chance for someone else to give you a chance, and you can keep building from there.
On the content side, just as a quick plug for NFX, if you don't subscribe to some of the NFX content, you're listening to this, you definitely should. It's some of the highest caliber quality content that exists. And it's a masterclass all over, all over the place. So definitely, would be a good, smart thing to do for founders, because there's a lot of high, very curated content that's targeted at founders. So yeah I think
just to add something, I think something that is particularly special about the Silicon Valley, and I think that has been the reason of why this region has succeeded so much, is that people like here really welcome builders and like just ambitious, smart people are really welcome here, regardless of where they're from. I think like there's some status games that are played in other parts of the world that definitely don't exist here. I think that one of the most special things is that here you can, connect with like super successful people, and they will be always willing to give their time, and just if they see that spark in you and like this kind of like willingness to succeed and prosper, you're always going to be given an opportunity here. But it's true that step by step is also important.
Yeah, when you say status games, give me an example of what you refer to, like outside of that kind of Silicon Valley bubble.
I don't want to criticize anyone, but like I don't know. For example, I will use Spain as an example. I think like sometimes, not everyone, but like sometimes founders there, that might not have accomplished things to the same level as some people have accomplished them here. They might be a bit more reserved or like less willing to share stuff, but it's a matter of like how the ecosystem or how the culture or the values are built up. It's nothing about the person. It's more just like what's perceived as normal or perceived as common. Like
I guess that kind of makes sense. Like if someone has been pretty successful and maybe they want to talk to other people that are like equally as successful or more successful maybe than them. And what you're saying is that in the Silicon Valley, there's less of a kind of protected line where it's like you don't have to have achieved an amazing high watermark in order for you to go have a chat with someone, because there's just a willingness to share. Is that kind of what?
Yeah, and I think and probably like the reason for that is that a lot of people that were successful at some point also had the experience of arriving here and like not quote unquote being no one, and then someone held them like a hand, and share information with them, share best practices, and those best practices being transformational to their own journey. So I think like the culture of giving back here is very strong because everyone has benefited one way or another from it in the past.
Do you think the counter to that, and don't worry, we don't have to like call out a whole country like Spain, but like Latin America, Spain, other places, do you think that part of the reason why there's less of a disposition is because kind of I don't want to call it like ruling class, but there's like a strong kind of wealthy segment of the population that maybe has kind of stayed like that for a long time? And is there less disposition to kind of let people in? What's our armchair psychology perspective on that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, some of the explanations that I've heard that have resonated the most, like as comparing, like, for example, Europe and in the United States is that, Europe has been obviously has existed for longer than the United States, right? Like these countries were created like so many years ago, and it feels like the mentality sometimes is more about conservation of what you have, just kind of like protection of what you have, versus like the United States, which is kind of like a new country that has been built in the last, few centuries, and like a country also made from immigrants, and like the mentality is more about building, not so much about conserving. So I think that's one of the things that can be at play here, but it's a hard question. I don't have the perfect answer to that.
Yeah, I don't either. It's fun to.
What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I don't know. The European perspective, I don't really have as much. I've been living in Latin America for a long time. And so I do think that like there is a disposition of Latin American founders that want to help other Latin American founders, because we've seen that at Latitude. And, I'm sure that exists everywhere in the world to some degree. At least what we've seen at Latitude is like when you ask a question, there's dozens of people that want to jump in and help. And there's varying degree of success of some of those people. And so I think that, at least from what I've seen over the last decade, as there become more successful people, there's more willingness. And I think that my reflection on this from a personal standpoint is that it's actually selfish to help. Like, I'll give you an example. I just had a call with a founder. They called me because they are selling their company and they needed help with something because there was some structure around the C Corp and what entity this company was going to buy. And I didn't invest in the company, but I know the founder, and I was, I spent 30 minutes on the phone talking through it. And they're like, oh yeah, and I'm starting another company, right? And so there's an inside look at the opportunity that comes just because of you're willing to take time. And it's not from like a transactional standpoint. Like, I take the call, I'm just like, all right, I'll just help this founder because, that's kind of what I do. Maybe there's an understanding of that where it's kind of altruistic and you want to help and all this stuff. But what happens is it compounds and there becomes, a lot of value that's created just by helping other people. Look, I'm not naive, and I'm not, someone that just is always helping. I realize that it actually benefits me when I help other people too. It's kind of selfish sometimes, And I mean, maybe charity is the same thing, right? Like when people give to causes, like they feel good about themselves. And so I think that there's an element to that. So I don't know the difference in different cultures or what that's like, but I have observed in Latin America, there is definitely a growing willingness to kind of support other founders because we've seen it happen organically in our community.
Yeah. And you guys are doing so much for that, right? And I think it's so important for the ecosystem to, set the values or like the shared kind of like understanding on what's right and wrong, and like people like giving without expecting anything in return, at least immediate, is kind of like so key for the ecosystem, for any ecosystem.
Yeah, it builds a lot of value, like compound value over time, when there's that paying for the car behind you on the toll. And then all of a sudden, like, they're like, wow, what a nice thing. And then like maybe they pay it forward. And so I do think that there's compound value that's created when there's that. And then also more success that happens in the region, the size of the region grows, the opportunities grow, and that has a lot of like positive benefits. I mean, I remember talking about this with David Velez on my episode with him, and he was like, we need all these other companies to be super successful for Nubank to be successful, right? And so I think that mentality maybe historically has not been as prevalent. And I don't know, part of my personal mission is to try to make sure that is something that is flourishing, because I know that it has a lot of really positive impacts.
Yeah, no, I think in Latin America, I feel like people are realizing. I mean, yeah, we wrote this article with Pete about we call it like why LatAm is on the rise, and something that I mentioned in that article is that something very special about Latin American founder is that I got the sense that they're not only thinking about their own success, but they're also thinking about helping with the successes of other companies, because they understand these dynamics that you are mentioning. That is basically like, if they're like success cases that you can point to in Latin America, that's going to benefit everyone else, right? Because, for example, international investors are going to look at the region and they're going to say, oh yeah, there were all these companies that did so well. So, I feel more comfortable going there and investing my money there because, we've already seen success in the past. So in a way, everyone benefits if things go well for everyone. And I think like, I get the sense that Latin American founders understand this very well, and it's very special. They don't see the pie as dividing it, It's more like, let's expand together that pie.
Yeah. What's your perspective on kind of the current moment? How does NFX, being a global firm, think about geographic investment opportunities? I know that NFX has been very active. I've co-invested as an angel before with NFX on a bunch of deals. And then, also our fund is co-invest, and then you've invested in our holding company. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at one of the largest seed funds in the world, when you look at the region, is there a allocation of capital that's set aside, or is there an opportunistic play where it's like the cream that rises to the top and it's like we do these deals just because we like them? What is the criteria for how you look at Latin America?
Yeah, so we don't have we don't set aside like a specific amount or percentage. Like, yeah, like our and we don't do it for any particular region. Like we basically invest mostly in the US, but also in Latin America, Israel, and Europe. And for any of these regions, we don't have like a dedicated allocation. We also don't have dedicated allocations for sectors. But we remain very excited about Latin America. We've been investing there since the very beginnings of our fund. At the time, it was not the plan, with something more like a really good opportunity come up. It was kind of like impossible to say no to, in terms of like how great the team was, how good the idea was, and that investment was made, and that investment like really made us look at the region more closely and learn about the opportunities within. And today we remain super excited about it and looking at a lot of opportunities. I would say NFX it's looking for very specific business models. Like, as you know, we are known for network effects. So these are kind of like the businesses that we understand the most and that we like investing in the most. So yeah, we're looking for these businesses everywhere, and trying to understand like what are the best opportunities.
Yeah, I think I think probably one of the reasons why they brought you on also is you speak Spanish, and obviously the Spanish speaking market is pretty large. Is there anyone else in the team that has some experience in Latin America? I mean, I know Pete invested. I think we co-invested in La House together back in the day. It was one of the first investments that NFX made in the region. Mm-hmm. When they brought you on, because NFX invested in your last company, right?
Correct.
And you went on to raise some additional capital after they invested in the seed round. So I assume that you built a relationship in that process, and then when you went over the other side of the table, was the thought process, let's create some more reinforcement of someone that can, dig into Latin America more, or was that just coincidental that you're from Spain and you speak Spanish, and that probably gives you better access in Latin America than, someone that doesn't?
So it was not that intentional at the time. I had shared my interest in like looking at businesses in the region, but like when I joined, like, the idea was more like, okay, go and find what's interesting to you. I think that's something that I really like about NFX, that they're big believers that you'll do well in whatever you are interested in, but after a few months with the firm, like it became pretty obvious to me that the most interesting opportunities that I was seeing were in Latin America. I was comparing. I mean, obviously sitting here in the US, I also see a lot of US deals, and even today, like I'm still investing in US companies. But I was seeing that like a lot of the companies that I was seeing in Latin America normally they had like, the impact to have more of a transformational business model, whereas in the US, with obviously exceptions, but like a lot of the things that I was seeing were more incremental. And I think this is a reflection of, a lot of things. If you think about like how things work in Latin America, there are certain sectors that are still dominated by big incumbents and by old ways of doing things. So I feel like the opportunity to come in as a tech entrepreneur and completely shake those industries and do something that is 10x better, that provides something that is 10x better than that exists, is just more present, just because the ecosystem is more nascent, right? Like in the US, or particularly in Silicon Valley, there has been people trying to do this for much longer. So a lot of those opportunities have already been captured. And this was kind of like really clear to me when I was like comparing like the opportunities. I would say right now with AI, we're seeing, we're back to also seeing like a lot of transformational stuff here in the US as well. But yeah, I think like Latin American entrepreneurs, there's a long list of like opportunities that are still to be captured.
You guys speaking of AI, you did a report on AI. You mapped 75 companies. And if you could give kind of the summary of your learnings of that report and, how should founders and investors be thinking about the category of AI? Because a lot of stuff I've said on the pod before, is like a lot of wrapper on, GPT and what are you thinking about? What's the internal dialogue look like around AI companies, and what is most exciting to you?
Yeah. So we've been seeing a lot of companies in AI. And I think kind of like my conclusion and what I'm spending the most time on these days is just thinking like, obviously like what new AI companies are going to be formed, right? But also like, and very importantly is like how like existing companies in our portfolio, for example, can benefit from using those AI products to just become like better companies overall, right? Like, I'm thinking a lot these days about, like when you look into the future, like how would like the typical startup look like in the future? Like, since like some, like if you're thinking, for example, about software development, like we have a lot of portfolio companies already like incorporating some of these tools and seeing like massive increases in productivity by their tech teams. Same with like marketing teams, like when you start using tools like Jasper and, other stuff, you're also seeing like massive increases in productivity. So it's like, how can we make sure that the companies in our portfolio are benefiting from all these? And maybe like the company of the future is run by very few people, like leveraging all these things. We'll need less money, which also impacts like our jobs, like, like the future funds like will shrink in size because like founders will need less, there are all these kind of things that are interesting.
I agree that, I was having a conversation with a founder the other day, and they were convinced that this would change a lot of the whole venture game because the efficiency of companies, the need to hire, will be reduced. And therefore, the check size, you could maybe liken it a little bit to, Amazon Web Services and, cloud computing,
Totally.
because that brought a whole layer of, cost savings and scalability that, that didn't exist before. And the cost of starting a company was much higher. I mean, the bottom line is that it changed dramatically, but it just enabled more opportunities, right? And so it just increased the number of companies that were being built, right? So
Totally.
maybe we'll see a lot more smaller companies that are doing, $10 million in revenue instead of, many more companies doing, whatever, 500 million.
Yeah. maybe that's the future. But yeah, I've thought about this parallelism as well. Like, yeah, cloud was really key to like the startup boom that we've seen in the last few years, right? Because basically like reduce the cost of starting a company. I think AI is a similar thing. Yeah.
So,
I would say it has also, I feel it has also come at the right time in the sense that like we're in a, market downturn in which like capital is less available. So tools that allow you to do more with less, like it's kind of like the perfect moment to leverage those tools.
I'd like you to expand on this. You wrote that article that you'd mentioned, you cited a few minutes ago about how, Latin America is on the rise. And then in the article, you'd mentioned something how building a company is a new form of public service. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for me?
I mean, this impacted me when I started meeting those LatAm entrepreneurs, that they were really, like the way they were thinking about starting a company. Yeah, they were doing it like partly, obviously, like for all the reasons that you would start a company, but also like they see it as a way to transform the region, like that do good for the region. They were like very, thoughtful about the problems that the region had and thinking about solutions to solve them. And, like their success was like the region's success and like the other people's in the region's success. So I think that's something more very special of Latin American founders. Is an ethos that I don't see in other parts of the world.
When you look at the investments that you've made, so how many investments has NFX made in Latin America? What's the total count?
We've made 10 investments and we've announced 8 of them.
How do you think about, as a global investor, you've co-invested with a handful of local investors and you'll co-invest with other investors. Is it something that you look for? Like, do you want a local on the ground partner when you invest? And like, what percentage of the funds that you've deployed are co-investment with other, co-leads?
Yeah, I would say it's a very high percentage, more than in the US. I feel like in the US, like we rarely co-invest with other funds. We normally like lead rounds and take the whole round normally. I think in Latin America, we're a bit more open and even like sometimes seeking for that partnership with local investors, because we understand that each of us will bring like different value to the table. And, I think they're like really great funds, like really great local funds that we like to work with and have very good relationships with. I wouldn't say like it's a need to have, like at this point, like we have enough of a network, like a local network to be, to feel comfortable doing investments on our own. But like we also like to co-invest with those investors and think like that it's a good partnership. And at the end, we're thinking about what's best for the entrepreneur as well, what's the best syndicate. And that varies from company to company, but very open to do that.
I have one last question for you before we wrap up here. And it's kind of a funny question. The other day I was talking to a founder and he had raised a seed round, but it was a pretty small seed round. And so he was going out to raise a $3 or $4 million, post seed, which you would call it a Series A. And I saw that he had NFX on the list. And what I told him, I said, hey, listen, NFX invests in seed rounds. Like they don't invest in Series A rounds. What is the internal dialogue in terms of like when it's too late for NFX to invest? Because in this case, it was a $3 or $4 million round, which is probably in your wheelhouse because it's a large fund and, you can deploy a $3 million check pretty easily. So what is kind of the cutoff where it's like, is it that there's another institutional investor that already led the round? Like is it the equity stake that when they come to you where they need to, there needs to be no more than 80 or 85% in the hands of the founders? Talk a little bit more about the definition of a seed round.
Yeah, good question. So we like to, our model is to invest at the seed stage, but it's true that in Latin America, we're a bit more open-minded to maybe take a look at Series A rounds than we are in the US. And there are a few reasons. Like one is that like Series A's in Latin America are normally smaller than in the US, so they match our check size. And at the end, like
which is where? Give us the range.
From 1 to 5.
Okay.
From 1 to 5. But I think like something important to take in mind, to keep into account is that, to your point, for us, for it to be an interesting opportunity for us, we need to be able to have like some meaningful ownership in that investment. So we wouldn't participate in the round if like the round is already like taken. And the reason for that is just like our model as a fund. Like we are what we call high conviction, high commitment. So we spend a lot of time with the entrepreneurs we back. So, and our time and resources are limited. So we need to make sure that we invest in a few select companies that we're able to support. And for that to make sense, we need like a certain level of ownership. But I would say, if it fits our check size, if there's space in the round for us to get there, we will take a look.
That makes sense. Yeah. What final advice would you give to startup founders here, listening today and looking to succeed in scaling their startups and impacting Latin America?
My advice would be to always be on the lookout of what's best in class in everything they do. And I think that's something, as an investor, I think that's one of the biggest values that we can add. Kind of like we have like this, we have this advantage of seeing thousands of companies and working with tens of them, and like having like a very clear understanding of like, okay, who are the founders doing the best job at these things, like different categories of things. And I think as a founder, you don't have the same advantage because you are on your own silo, like working on your company. So I think like making the effort of constantly be asking like your investors or other people, like, who do you know that does the best job at this? And making sure that you get connected to that person and, like that knowledge is shared. I think it's the fastest way to learn and level up as a founder. So I would be always striving to be on the top, decile of how things are done. It can be fundraising, operating. I think that's a question that we should be getting more often than we are.
You made me, your response made me want to ask another question. So I'm going to wrap it up with one last question, which is, NFX is world-class at producing content and you've actually built software, which is not very common for a fund to do. How important has the software, Signal and these other products, along with the content, been in building a brand, sourcing, and winning deals? How much would you attribute the efforts there to the success of being able to kind of win the best deals?
I think a lot, I think those efforts are really important to our fund for a few reasons. I think like many times, like the founders that we meet are founders that have been subscribers of our content for a while. So I think there's like this interesting dynamic in which like they feel like they already know us, right? So it's not like a new relationship that you're starting. It's something that they already know how we think, and so we don't need to spend so much time kind of like proving ourselves. So I think like again back to this thing of like giving without expecting anything in return. Like through our content, through the products that we've built for the community, I think we have already proved that we're giving stuff to them. So we don't need to do like such a effort of sales because we've already done it. So definitely super super important. And it's also also selfishly is something that we love to do. Like everyone at NFX has been a founder before, so I think like the opportunity to continue being involved with building in a way, either like through the products that we build and through the content is something that keep us a bit alive and connected to that like builder side that we all have. So yeah.
I think it keeps you sharp, right? Like I'm so grateful I get to have this podcast because I get to talk to investors, founders from all over LatAm and, in the US. And it's something that, I feel like I get to learn progressively over time, more by staying connected. And so I think that, it's good that there's a natural inclination, because I don't think every VC can go out and just produce a ton of content. If they're not passionate about it, it'll come across as kind of gimmicky content. But there's a lot of thought that goes into the content at NFX. So that's really great. Well, thank you for making the time, and I hope that maybe at some point you'll invite me back to the podcast. Maybe give a shout out to your podcast too on here, so that anyone listening, if they don't subscribe, y habla en español, ahí se puede escuchar contenido en español sobre el sector de tech y venture capital in LatAm, no? What's the best way to listen to your podcast?
So you can listen to it in all the main platforms. It's called Beta Podcast LatAm, and it's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast. We also have like a Twitter account where you can also find the links to all this. But yeah, Beta Podcast LatAm.
Awesome.
And yeah, Brian, we would love to have you on very soon.
I'm excited to stay in contact, and you've got 3 great co-hosts, and it's people that I'm already a fan of, and so I welcome any time to come back, and thank you for making the time, and thank you for being a supporter of Latitud.
Thank you for having me. It was super fun.